10 earthquakes in 5 hours sounds like the kind of headline people scroll past too quickly because the number feels abstract until you realize what it really means. It means one section of Earth's crust kept failing again and again under the same stretch of sea. It means one of the most dangerous coastlines in the Pacific did not simply shake once and go quiet. It means a boundary that already produced a deadly major earthquake weeks ago is still adjusting, still redistributing stress, still reminding everyone in southern Philippines that the disaster did not end when the first sirens faded. And the most important part of this story is not just that 10 earthquakes struck. It is that scientists are increasingly treating the sequence not as 10 separate surprises, but as part of one much larger rupture story that may still be unfolding beneath the Cotabato Trench. If you look only at the raw headline, the story seems simple. On August 5th, a cluster of earthquakes struck the same general offshore region near Sarangani and Davao Occidental within roughly 5 hours. One of the strongest shocks was around magnitude 6.3 to 6.4, depending on the agency reporting it. A later event reached the mid-5s. Smaller shocks filled the space in between. To someone far away, that sounds like a nervous burst of activity on a restless fault. But to people living along the southern coast of Mindanao, that pattern feels very different. It feels like the ground is returning to finish a sentence it never finished the first time. That first sentence began on the morning of June 8th, when a magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck offshore near Masim, Sarangani. Philippine authorities said the quake was tied to subduction along the Cotabato Trench, with an epicenter about 32 kilometers west of Masim and a depth of roughly 33 kilometers. It generated destructive shaking, a tsunami warning, and real tsunami waves recorded along parts of the coast. In the hours immediately after the main shock, Fivolks had already logged more than 100 aftershocks, and officials warned they could continue for days to weeks. That was the official language early on. But what followed turned days to weeks into something much bigger. The sequence did not simply fade into the background. It kept going. That is the angle I want to take in this script, because it is stronger, more professional, and frankly, more unsettling than treating this as a random burst of fresh earthquakes. The better question is not, why did 10 earthquakes suddenly hit one dangerous coastline? The better question is, what happens when a trench system that already produced a major rupture refuses to settle down? What does it mean when the same part of the Philippine margin keeps breaking? Weeks after a disaster that killed dozens, injured hundreds, displaced tens of thousands, and physically changed the shape of the coast itself? The June 8th earthquake was not just strong on paper. It was one of the most consequential seismic events to hit the Philippines in years. Associated Press reporting said at least 37 people were killed, nearly 500 were injured, and more than 32,000 were displaced as rescuers searched damaged buildings and landslide zones. Around General Santos and nearby provinces, buildings collapsed, debris fell, schools were damaged, and communities feared the return of the sea as tsunami waves measured as high as about 1.4 meters above tide level. Officials also pointed back to history because the Cotabato Trench is not just another offshore feature on a map. It is part of the same broad danger system that produced the catastrophic 1976 Moro Gulf earthquake and tsunami, the kind of event that still hangs over every discussion of southern Philippine coastal risk. And then there was the shoreline. One of the most visually shocking consequences of the June event was coastal uplift. Sections of coastline in Sarangani and Davao Occidental reportedly rose by around 2 meters, with the shoreline in some places pushed outward by roughly 200 meters. That matters because it turns invisible fault motion into something people can actually see and walk on. Reefs that had been underwater were suddenly exposed. Marine habitats were damaged. Fishing communities saw their seafront transformed. A trench rupture beneath the sea had literally rewritten the coastline. Once that happens, you stop thinking of the earthquake as a brief event. You start understanding it as a process. That is why the 10 earthquakes in 5 hours matter. They are not alarming just because there were many of them. They are alarming because they happened on a margin that has already demonstrated it is still in adjustment mode after a major rupture. When faults break, they do not release stress neatly like opening a valve and draining a tank. They redistribute that stress into neighboring patches, shallower sections, deeper sections, branching structures, and adjacent locked pieces. Some areas relax, some areas tighten, some areas begin to creep, some fail later as aftershocks. What looks like a chain of separate earthquakes on a map can actually be one fault system trying and failing to find a new equilibrium. That idea is the heart of the competitor video, and it is the part worth preserving because it gives the story both narrative power and scientific logic. But I want to present it with more clarity. Imagine the June 8th rupture as a violent tear along an already loaded seam. The main shock did not solve the entire stress problem. It changed the stress field. It left neighboring pieces of the same tectonic system more fragile, more uncertain, and in some cases closer to failure. So when 10 earthquakes strike the same coastline in 5 hours, The correct framing is not that nature suddenly got dramatic for a single afternoon. The correct framing is that the fault never really stopped talking. There is another detail that makes this sequence especially compelling for a geoplanet-style script. Not every strong earthquake cluster means the same thing. Sometimes a swarm is just a swarm. Five Oaks itself has stressed that earthquake swarms may or may not lead to stronger earthquakes. Some gradually release energy and die out. Some are simply part of a broader tectonic episode. Officials said it would be inaccurate to claim that earlier swarms directly triggered the June 8th major earthquake, even though swarm activity had been observed along the Cotabato Trench before that event. In other words, science does not reward lazy certainty here. That gives us a better tone, not panic, not false comfort, controlled tension. And controlled tension is exactly what this story deserves, because this coastline has earned its reputation. The southern Philippines sits along an immensely active tectonic environment on the Pacific Ring of Fire. The Cotabato Trench marks a subduction zone, the kind of boundary where one slab of the Earth's crust is forced beneath another. Those systems are capable of generating powerful earthquakes and, under the wrong geometry, tsunamis. Add coastal communities, fishing towns, uneven construction quality, landslide-prone terrain, and the psychological exhaustion of repeated shaking, and you get a hazard environment that is dangerous long before the next extreme event arrives. Now here is where many videos become shallow. They see 10 earthquakes in 5 hours and immediately jump to the biggest possible conclusion. The big one is coming. The coast is about to break. A mega tsunami is imminent, but if you actually want to keep audience trust while holding attention, you need to explain why scientists are worried without pretending they can predict the exact next move. Earthquake science is powerful, but it is not prophecy. No serious agency can tell you the exact time of the next destructive rupture. What they can tell you is whether a region is active, whether the current sequence fits aftershock behavior, whether stress is still being redistributed, whether the depth and mechanism change the danger, and whether history suggests special reason for caution. That brings us to depth, one of the most overlooked parts of this entire story. A magnitude number alone does not tell the whole danger. A deeper earthquake can spread its energy over a wider area, but sometimes cause less concentrated destruction at the surface. A shallower quake can feel more violent because the energy has less rock to travel through before reaching towns, roads, slopes, and coastlines. The competitor video made this point well, and it matters here too. In practical terms, people do not live at magnitude. They live at intensity. They live at how hard the buildings move, how far the cabinets swing, whether slopes give way, whether seawalls are overtopped, whether roads crack, whether power drops, whether families run. Five Oaks bulletins for the August 5 activity described one of the major aftershocks as an aftershock of the June magnitude 7.8 offshore Sarangani earthquake and the June magnitude 6.5 offshore Davao Occidental event, with reported intensities reaching intensity 5 in places like Glan and Ballad Island. Another later aftershock in the mid-5s was also explicitly tied to the June sequence. That language is important. It means the local scientific authority is not treating these earthquakes as disconnected curiosities. It is treating them as belonging to the same broader seismic episode. And once you see the story that way, the 5-hour cluster stops looking like a spike and starts looking like evidence. Evidence that the rupture zone remains alive. Evidence that the aftershock field is still capable of producing meaningful jolts. Evidence that even weeks after a major offshore quake, communities along that coastline are still living inside the event, not after it. That difference is not poetic, it is operational. It changes how people think about readiness, building inspection, slope stability, evacuation fatigue, school reopening, port activity, fishing, and sleep itself. Sleep matters more than people think in earthquake stories. Not because it sounds dramatic, but because repeated nighttime or early morning shaking changes behavior. People stop trusting walls. They begin sleeping lightly, dressed, with phones charged and bags near doors. They memorize the sound of the first rattle. They interpret every truck, every gust, every wave slam as a possible precursor. When the map shows 10 earthquakes in 5 hours, the human experience is not 10 entries on a data feed. The human experience is the return of uncertainty, and uncertainty is its own disaster multiplier. There is also the tsunami question, which always follows offshore earthquakes in this part of the world. Viewers hear dangerous coastline and assume every strong aftershock should trigger a new warning. But tsunami generation depends on how the seafloor moves. Vertical displacement is the key issue. If a fault lifts or drops the seafloor enough to shove a huge volume of water, then the danger escalates quickly. If the motion is dominated by a geometry that does not create that same water column displacement, the tsunami risk can be much smaller even when the quake is strongly felt. That is why warning systems sometimes stay quiet during later shocks, and that silence can be both correct and emotionally confusing, because communities that already lived through one tsunami warning may not know whether to interpret the next quiet response as safety or hesitation. This is where professional scripting has to be responsible. We can say the sequence is alarming. It is. We can say the coast is among the more dangerous seismic coastlines in the region. It is. We can say the fault system has a long memory and a violent history. It does. But we should not say every cluster means catastrophe is hours away. The stronger line and the more credible one is this. The recent sequence shows that the June rupture did not cleanly conclude. The fault system is still releasing, migrating, and adjusting stress beneath a coastline that has already proved how vulnerable it is. History deepens that tension. In 1976, the Moro Gulf earthquake and tsunami killed thousands in the southern Philippines. That event remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in the country's modern record. Mentioning it is not fear-mongering when you do it correctly. It is context. It explains why an offshore rupture near the Cotabato system is never treated casually. It explains why officials talk about vigilance even when the immediate tsunami threat has passed. It explains why people along this coast do not hear aftershock as a technical footnote. They hear it as a reminder that the same undersea architecture that devastated earlier generations still exists below them. There is a tendency online to imagine tectonic systems as machines with neat reset buttons. Big quake happens, energy releases, danger falls, story ends. Real faults do not behave that cleanly. Some aftershock sequences decay fast. Others stay active much longer. Some clusters illuminate unrecognized structures. Some show that rupture propagated complexity into neighboring segments. Some reveal that what looked like one event was actually a larger zone of instability. That is why the 5-hour sequence deserves attention. Not because 10 is a spooky number, but because the clustering pattern says the system remains dynamic. And notice how the strongest version of this story is actually not about the most extreme claim. It is about the most revealing one. The revealing part is that the coast itself has become a record of recent tectonic violence. The uplifted shoreline, the exposed reefs, the damaged buildings, the felt intensities, the continuing bulletins, the aftershock labeling, the repeated public warnings, the school inspections, the landslide concern, the fear of another offshore jolt at the wrong hour. These are not side notes. They are all pieces of the same message. The earthquake was not just an instant. It became an environment. That is also why the title should be tuned for your channel. 10 earthquakes in 5 hours. Just hit one of the most dangerous coastlines on Earth is clickable, but it sounds slightly generic. For GeoPlanet, the sharper, more channel-consistent version is this. 10 earthquakes in 5 hours. Just hit the Philippine coast, but scientists say the rupture never ended. That second half gives the audience a reason to stay. It also matches your stronger videos, where the hook is dramatic, but the payoff is explanatory. Instead of selling only shock, it sells interpretation. So if we build the script around that angle, the middle section becomes much stronger. We do not simply repeat the quake count. We walk the viewer into the geology. The Philippine archipelago is carved by active trenches, faults, and volcanic systems because it sits where several tectonic plates interact. The Cotabato Trench off southern Mindanao is one of those major earthquake-generating structures. When a major offshore rupture happens there, the danger is distributed across more than just one coastline town. It propagates into transport, housing, schools, fishing grounds, reefs, ports, and public psychology. The August 5 cluster is therefore best understood as a reminder that tectonic disasters have long tails. Long tails are what separate a viral disaster headline from a memorable disaster script. The headline says something happened. The long tail explains why it still matters after the alerts fade. Weeks after the June 8th main shock, Five Oaks and news outlets were still discussing aftershock counts in the thousands. Reports connected the continuing activity to broader concern about swarms, trench behavior, and public preparedness. The 5-hour cluster is dramatic on its own, but in context it becomes even more compelling. This coastline was struck, altered, and then revisited by the same tectonic story over and over again. And there is one more reason this should worry people without pushing them into fantasy. Repeated, moderate to strong offshore earthquakes can keep damaging what was already weakened. A building that survived the first event with hidden cracks may not perform the same way during later shaking. A slope destabilized in June may fail in August after another jolt or heavy rain. Communities that evacuate repeatedly may become slower the next time. Fishermen may return to familiar waters because life has to continue. Officials face the impossible balance between overwarning and underwarning. This is how hazard becomes layered, not only through one spectacular rupture, but through the accumulation of strain, damage, fatigue, and uncertainty. That is the emotional center of the story. Not apocalypse, but attrition. Not one doomsday moment, but a coastline being tested again before it has fully recovered from the first test. When you frame it that way, the audience does not just hear a statistic. They feel the unfinishedness of it. They understand why a scientist looking at 10 earthquakes in 5 hours would not necessarily say, "This is unprecedented chaos." They might say something quieter and more serious. This fault zone is still working through the consequences of a major rupture. And sometimes the quieter sentence is the more frightening one, because it leaves room for reality. Reality says the sequence could continue to decay without another major disaster. Reality also says strong aftershocks remain possible after major trench earthquakes. Coastal communities should not mistake reduced headlines for restored safety. Reality says preparedness still matters long after global attention moves on. Reality says the same coast that just rose from the sea can still be shaken by the fault that lifted it. If I were closing this video for maximum retention and credibility, I would bring the viewer back to the image that defines the entire sequence. Not the map, not the number 10, the shoreline itself. Imagine standing on a piece of coast that was underwater weeks ago. Imagine looking at reef now exposed to the sun because the earth beneath you moved upward during a single violent morning. Now imagine that same region continuing to shake in clusters, as if the ocean floor has not finished adjusting to what happened. That is the real story, not a freak burst, not a glitch in the data. A rupture with a long afterlife. So, no, the most important fact here is not that 10 earthquakes hit in 5 hours. The most important fact is that one of the world's most dangerous seismic coastlines is still in conversation with a major rupture that happened weeks ago, and that conversation is being conducted through aftershocks, stress transfer, coastal change, and persistent uncertainty. The June earthquake killed, displaced, and transformed. The August sequence reminded everyone that tectonic events do not always end when the first wave retreats or the first news cycle closes. If the story feels unusually intense, that is because it deserves to be handled with respect. The Philippine coast near Sarangani is not just another place where the ground shook. It is a living fault frontier where subduction, memory, and modern vulnerability meet in the same narrow geography. 10 earthquakes in 5 hours are alarming, yes. But what makes them truly important is the pattern they belong to. A pattern that began with a major offshore rupture, continued through thousands of aftershocks, reshaped the shoreline, and has now reminded the world that some earthquakes are over in seconds, while others keep unfolding long after the map stops trending. Earth are not always the ones making headlines every week. They are often the ones where immense tectonic energy builds offshore, mostly out of sight, until one rupture suddenly exposes every weakness at once. Southern Mindanao had ports, schools, highways, coastal housing, fishing communities, and mountain settlements, all tied to the same day of shaking in June, and all of them remain part of the same risk web now. When later aftershocks strike, they do not arrive in a vacuum. They arrive in places where walls may already be cracked, where evacuation routes may already be stressed, where coral damage may already be hurting livelihoods, and where trust in the difference between routine tremor and genuine emergency may already be fraying. That is why the right reaction to a 5-hour cluster is neither hysteria nor indifference. It is disciplined attention. Watch the official bulletins. Respect the aftershock labels. Understand that a coast changed by uplift is a coast that has already proved the amount of force involved. And remember that the phrase aftershock sequence can sound deceptively small even when the lived reality is anything but small. For the viewer, the final takeaway is simple. This was not 10 random earthquakes dropping out of nowhere onto a famous danger zone. This was a stressed tectonic margin continuing to reveal the consequences of a major June rupture. That is what gives the story its weight, its continuity, and its urgency. The fault is not performing for the cameras. It is doing what active subduction margins do after a big break, adjusting in pieces, speaking in pulses, and reminding every coastal community above it that the ground beneath the sea is still rearranging the terms of safety, still unfinished beneath the waves.